everyone. Good morning. I'm Lee McEwan from Publicis Group here in Lausanne. And our agency in the world is around about 85,000 people specializing in marketing communication. Our sport and entertainment team specializes in research, in strategy, in creativity, and media in order to connect audiences with sports and with brands. I'm going to start with a sport that perhaps hasn't been practiced in earnest for many years. If you think back to the 13th, perhaps the 16th century at the latest, jousting would have been considered a normal sport, loved by kings, by nobility. Now, I would say that the sport is no longer really considered something that we would consider to be popular. Of course, what's happened is change. We no longer think that killing for sport is something that is actually good entertainment, and things move. And what you'll see, hopefully, as I talk today, is the trends that are taking place around sustainability broadly, and the impact perhaps they'll have on the future of sport. This is Ernest Hemingway's house in Peru. It's now a museum. Ernest Hemingway, of course, was celebrated as a hunter, a trophy hunter. But times have changed here again, of course. When we see animals on the wall, it feels no longer really of the now. Only last month, the UK outlawed the import of trophies from hunting, joining France, the Netherlands, and others in considering this to be barbaric. You see protests around the world about what is considered to be a sport. Bogota, a month and a half ago, in Colombia, there was a protest against the resumption of bullfighting. Some markets, of course, consider this to be normal. In the UK, the Grand National, only a month ago again, was disrupted at the beginning by protesters and fundamentally believing that horse racing isn't a sport that should be allowed. On a smaller scale, if you think even at the small events, so this is about 3 weeks ago in North London, in Finsbury Park, the Tough Mudder obstacle course series is now banned from being a user of the park because it ripped up the mud. Now, obviously, they could have seen that coming, but even at a small scale, you see that the actions of people are being evaluated. Sport as a platform, of course, is something that is used to do good in the world, but also you see it being disrupted by, again, only April 2023, the Just Stop Oil guys turned up at the World Snooker Championships in Sheffield. Nothing to do with snooker, everything to do with their protest and the captive eyeballs. In January of this year in Berlin, we saw a disruption at the beginning of the Formula E. Yes, that's the eco-friendly motorsport that was being targeted in order to be disrupted. And of course, as we all know, 2022 was a controversial World Cup in the eyes of many, where, yes, a social issue mainly, the human rights were being used as a reason to protest against the sport. Here, of course, you've got the German team protesting about the fact they couldn't protest. And I bring this up, as I say, because times do change, and because we're living in a time where sport as a business is a very large and growing entity. You're talking about estimates of $500 billion for the overall value of sport, including apparel and other things. That's going to grow by 2030, forecast to more like 826 billion. And so you see the eyes of the world are on sport, and always have been, but increasingly will be. And the more of a business it is, the more that happens. It's not clicking. There we go. And so The Economist, for example, after the World Cup, published this, summarizing what they saw as being the environmental, specifically, impacts of various mega events. And you can see some progress here if you look at the Olympics, moving from the London 2012, Rio, and then reduced for Tokyo. But of course, Qatar saw an impact that had increased on previous World Cups. The challenge, of course, being quite unsporting things need to be done for sport. Construction, travel, accommodation, those are the things that are driving most of the sustainability impacts from an environmental standpoint. And people have estimated the overall impact of the emissions of sport. Admittedly, these are very difficult things to estimate, but if you take a low and a high estimate, the low estimate would be that sport emits about as much as Cuba every year. That's around 30 million tons of CO2. If you actually think at the upper end, though, it's about 10 times that. You could estimate that 300 million tons of CO2 are emitted by sporting activities each year. And that puts you on a par with Spain, Italy, France. They're all around the same. Switzerland, of course, for those interested, is much a smaller country and is more like Cuba. So where do people come into this? To go back to Tom's point from earlier on, 80% agree we're heading for an environmental disaster unless we change our habits quickly. That's quite a strong statement. This is from Ipsos's Global Trends from the start of this year. They interviewed 50,000 people in 50 different countries. And you can see that that's strongly worded. But the key thing to note is the change that takes place over time as people have gradually come to the realization that things need to change. There's always going to be 20%, but that's 80% believing that. But human nature is a funny thing. There's a real difference between what we actually say and what we do, as you'll be aware. So on the one hand, 81% say that sustainability is important to them, but on the other hand, only 45% are willing to put their money where their mouth is and actually pay more for products, for example, that are sustainable. And you'll find this everywhere in the literature around sustainability, that the real task is trying to get people to actually change, not just to think about it. So as a famous ad man once said, Bill Bernbach, if principles are nothing unless they cost you something. But perhaps hope comes in understanding people better. Fundamentally, we are not angels. And those who are sports people probably know better than anybody else that we're very competitive and we're very social creatures. We want to be seen in a certain way by those around us. One experiment that was constructed made it very clear that if you were actually participating in making a choice, that you would make a more sustainable choice if you were being watched. And so it's very telling about us. We think in a certain way. So if you want to actually motivate somebody to change, to be more sustainable, you have to really think about not just offering them a good thing, but offering them something that's for them. So this echoes some of the things that Tom was saying earlier on. Fundamentally, we're born from apes. You have to understand how we actually think, rather than trying to just say, look, this is the right thing to do. But if you do offer an example, and if your organization has principles and wishes to go out there and defend them, you get support for it. 87% of people say that they'll buy more products from those who have a point of view that they agree with and take a stand on it. The problem is that there's 76% of people, same survey, who say that if you have an opinion and they disagree with it, that they'll boycott you. So what can you do if you're trying to change things as an organization and you believe in your values? It's difficult to believe that your initiatives are necessarily going to be well received in the world. And this is one of the big challenges for organizations acting for good, is that not everybody is going to be aligned with your values. Not everybody is going to want to do what you want to do or believe in your purpose. Ultimately, though, in sport, perhaps you're on the right side, obviously, if you believe that sustainability is a priority, because as this is from Nielsen data, 84% of global sports fans consider environmental sustainability to be an important issue, and some will even act on it. 55% saying they'll be more likely to actually attend an event that is itself considered sustainable. Again, that's they're under scrutiny. They're being seen. They'll act responsibly. But not all sports are equal, and not all sports fans are equal. This is UK data from YouGov from last year. It shows that some sports attract more environmentalists than others. Kind of obvious. But at the top there, you can see that cycling, running, sports like swimming are things that are much more likely to attract those who are environmentalists. Down at the bottom there, motorsport, perhaps unsurprisingly, and football, obviously one of the most popular things in the world. Zipping something, there we go. When you think about different kinds of sports and their impacts, of course, you have to remember that popularity, scale, is really one of the main dimensions upon which a sport can be judged. It's not your fault you're popular. Fundamentally, football, billions, 4 billion people, I think, are fans or participants in football worldwide. That is going to have its own impact. You can't change that. You can't just run away from it. You have to face up to it. Motorsport, of course, largely because of emissions, but you can see the changes they've been making with things like Formula E. Skiing, significant impacts on the actual natural habitat, along with golf and things like fishing. And then you see the acts of an event having their own small impacts. Even esports, of course, it's fundamentally consuming a great deal of energy. And even those who only need just a little bit of apparel, perhaps a pair of short shorts and a surfing board, are still themselves consuming something. So there's no such thing as a totally sustainable sport. In the same way, there's no such thing as a totally sustainable person. You know, ultimately, we all have impacts, and we need to think about them. But it's a good thing to actually promote sustainability, despite what I was saying about the fact that people might judge you for it. Ultimately, it can lead to increased fan loyalty, increases in brand recognition, and ultimately positive media coverage. But you do have to be careful. I love this initiative, and no offense to Tom, I don't think was involved in it at Adidas. They used Kermit the Frog to launch a more recycled version of the Stan Smith. And in doing so, unfortunately, they caught the wrath of the French and specifically their advertising ethics committee. As Kermit would say, it's not easy being green. The reason why they called them out was because claiming to end plastic waste, while effectively you're still asking people to consume your product, was seen as hypocrisy by the French government. And fundamentally, whilst the trainers were more recycled, they weren't sufficiently recycled to have no impact at all. You can't win. And when it comes to, and so accusations of sport washing effectively also come into this. So in comes a brand, the brand wants to participate in a sport. No one's perfect, no organization is perfect. And so organizations find themselves going, should we partner with this particular brand? Should we partner with this sport at all? In the case of Barclays, and I'm not accusing them of sports washing, but there's just a coincidence that took place back in 2015. The coincidence was that they were fined the largest single fine in UK financial history. That same year, they pulled out of the Premier League and the ATP. I don't know what happened there. It's not public, but you can see how those partners weren't really meant to be from that point onwards. And so this isn't just environmental impacts. That's something that people would judge socially or economically as well as environmentally. One of the main challenges then for any organization is whether or not to say anything at all. Sports is ultimately in a situation like any other organization where you sit there and you go, should we? Shouldn't we? Is there a risk in taking part? Should we actually hold back and not say anything about sustainability? And that leads to a thing that's known as green hushing, which is arguably worse than anything else, because then your sustainability initiatives are not well known. When it comes to partnerships with brands, with sponsorships, with bringing money into sport, fundamentally you have to worry about cancellation. This idea that a brand or an organization might pull back from a relationship. The reason why they do it is things like brand safety issues. It's like having a reputation tarnished through a relationship or an association with somebody that you do not actually want to be a partner with anymore. And so using some examples from my time at Jaguar Land Rover, this is the very unlikely car that we used as a support vehicle for the Tour de France in 2015. But at that Tour de France, there were rumors that the partner, Team Sky, had been doping. Rumors at the time. Come 2016, of course, that partnership was not renewed. And so the brand asks itself the questions, as the sport should, are we meant for each other? Same year, we went into Formula E, a better fit with our values, in the sense that the future of performance in automotive was moving towards EVs, and we wanted to be able to embrace that. In other work that we were doing, this is in South Africa, we embraced grassroots rugby. And this was seen, this is kind of a way to try and help you understand how brands sometimes think. You don't get a lot of scale out of grassroots activity, but you do get the ability to make a difference. In this particular instance, we took that thing in the background, which is a club inside a container, loads of equipment and things we were able to take out to some of the townships. And that demonstrated one thing to the product guys: oh, you can tow it on the back of a Land Rover Discovery. But two, it also allowed us to talk to the customers that we wanted to for the Land Rover Discovery. They're South African parents, mums and dads, who would of course respond to this, which is a story about building the next generation of sport. And so there are many opportunities to think around a partnership and how brands can work together with sporting organizations, right down to the grassroots. But there are many challenges in the analogy between what is sport and what is sustainability. For those working in this area, you'll be very familiar with the fact that there's no real finish line to sustainability. We can make promises like net zero, they're very valid, but it's not the end point, is it? What happens after that? It's an infinite process. You don't stop thinking about making sure that your habitat is good or that your people are happy. And so fundamentally, we have to remember, whilst it can be helpful to do that, this is by definition a never-ending exercise. But one thing's for sure, I would say that sport, with its billions of passionate fans and participants, has the power, really, to change the world for the better. It might feel lonely at times, but there's many supporters out there. But when you're on your own, it can often be the case that you're banging the drum for sustainability in your organization, but you have to be reassured that we, all of us, can make a difference. And on that note, I'll say thank you, and I'll ask you, please, to join us as we go and have a conversation in the fishbowl at the back, where there are multiple participants, including Tom from earlier, who will be answering questions. So I've been asked to be Pied Piper. Thank you.